In 2015, I came here with my colleagues and we started this research, Talking Houses. We tried to examine, explore the histories of the different buildings in the downtown, public buildings and also private homes. And of course, we reconstructed the life stories of those people who use these buildings, who live there. And we tried to connect the micro level of the local history with the macroscopic narrative of the history of Hungary. As a result of this research, which is an interdisciplinary research because music historians, literary researchers were also involved as social historians, and this book came out as a result in last year, after 4 years of the first, visits to Kőszeg. Kőszeg entered the European news in 1532 thanks to
Hankiss,
who actually talked about the siege of the castle. Suleiman I, the Ottoman emperor, wanted to occupy Vienna, and this small castle Kőszeg was in between, or in the road to Vienna. Miklós Jurisic, who was the Croatian captain of the castle, was able to stop this huge army. The siege lasted for 3 weeks in August 1532. The defenders of the castle were able to keep the castle. You have to understand that it was a very small group of people, only a few hundreds of peasants and a few dozens of real soldiers. So after fighting for or defending the place for 3 weeks, Jurisic made an agreement with the Turks. They could put the flag on the castle, but physically they never occupied the place. This building was one of the centers of the defensive system of Kőszeg. If you look at the window behind me, you can see it's very small, and the wall looks very old and thick, and the reason is that we are in the old tower of Kőszeg. Most likely it was built originally in the 14th century, and then it survived many centuries, a long time period. By the end of the 18th century, the defensive function was not really important anymore for Kőszeg. So instead of being a fortress, it became an intellectual center and an administrative center of the region. And this building was, this building needed a new function for itself. So there were many ideas. In the 1820s, local people thought about turning this building into a theater, but this plan has never been realized. Then it served as a storehouse for the city. It might be the case, it's not entirely sure, that it was also a prison for a while. But what we know for sure, that after the Second World War, in the 1960s, it became a pub. And lately, during the past few years, we use it, our institution, for important academic events, conferences, lectures, public lectures, and at times we also organize exhibitions at the ground floor. So, Kőszeg was the city of scrolls. It has been since the Middle Ages, but now we talk about a little later period, the 17th century. The city was turned to be Protestant once the Reformation was introduced in Europe, suddenly. But then Recatholicization was decided by the Habsburg Emperor and the Catholic Church. They decided that Kőszeg should be a center of this Recatholicization, and as we know, religion was spread through education. This building, I think, symbolizes this education of the Catholics because it was established as the center of the Jesuit order in Kőszeg. This was turned to be a school in the second half of the 17th century in 1677, and for 100 years it operated as an important school in the region. The Jesuit period was a founding narrative in Hungarian intellectual life and also in the intellectual life of the city. Important figures served in the Jesuit order here in Kőszeg, who were responsible for renewing the Hungarian language, grammar, literature, and they were in power and they operated here until the dissolution of the Jesuit order in 1777, when Joseph II, as an enlightened ruler, decided to renew the Catholic Church. This is a unique building. It was not only under the control of the Jesuits, but also, after the dissolution of the order, under the control of the Piarists, which was another order responsible for education. It didn't last this period for long, only for a few decades, and from 1815 the Benedictine order took the role of the leader here, and for more than 100 years they controlled education in Kőszeg. The Benedictines were responsible for a big shift in the history of education here because they renewed the basic teaching positions and roles in the city. The important historical turning point followed after the Second World War, when during the communist regime the historical churches were basically forbidden to operate in Hungary, so the building was taken from the Benedictines, and for long decades it could not serve its basic function or fulfill its basic function. And then lately the Institute of Advanced Studies of Kőszeg took the building, and now it's under construction, it's almost finished, and hopefully this vivid intellectual life which Kőszeg enjoyed for hundreds of years will return to this place. This is one of the most unique buildings here at this square. We know about the owners from the beginning of the 18th century, but before we would talk about the older owners of the building, I think it's very important to understand the technique, how it was decorated, I mean the front. It's a very unique technique taken from Italy, and that's the only house in Hungary where they applied. The name is sgraffito, and it means that the constructor applied different layers, several layers on the front of the building, and they scrapped the top layer, and that's how finally it was made. Again, sgraffito, the Italian name. And the other thing what you can immediately notice when you are standing in front of the building is a Latin citation. It comes from Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans, and I think you should try to translate it for yourself. It says, "Non est volentis neque currentis, sed miserentis Dei," which in English you should figure out what it is, and perhaps we can discuss very enigmatic message to the tourists in the city. So about the owners, I don't think it makes sense to go into the details. The most important story is that love. It was about love. The owners were surgeons, and beyond that they shared the profession, they shared illegitimate love stories, one after the other. A pattern was that they were interested in the neighbor's wife. Sometimes they made kids, sometimes just without kids they had love affairs. So that's what we know for sure. These days, this is the library of our institution. We have several thousands of books here, and the library is under development, so we always buy older new books and also database for the readers who come here. So you are absolutely welcome to use the library during the summer university. You can see the name of Jakab Zsigrai here, who died at a very young age, the age of 31, which is unusual even by the standards of the 18th century. He was a hero. All Hungarian kids are familiar with his name. The reason is that he participated in an uprising against the Habsburgs, but otherwise he was an easygoing guy. He spoke 7 languages. We already visited the Jesuit order's house. He actually went to that school, so he received a very good training here in Kőszeg. And as a young person, he visited Vienna very often, and he was very well known for his love life. He had many lovers, and he just enjoyed his life and friends. Jakab Zsigrai was executed for participating in a conspiracy against the Habsburgs right after the French Revolution, and this conspiracy was considered as very dangerous, politically speaking, and that's why the main organizers were executed. This is an ad from the local newspaper Kőszeg and its environment, an ad which was done by a young Hungarian man. He was an ex-student just out of the university because his father denied to pay off his bills. And he decided to come to Kőszeg and open a graphologist office. And he happened to find a place here in this building. Later he became a pretty well-known writer, so once he left Kőszeg, he settled down at the Lake of Balaton, and he wrote many novels, especially for young people. He was very popular as a writer of the youth. The third person I would mention here in this building is a spy. Perhaps the most exotic life story is hers. Her name was Mary Ellison Waters. She was the wife of the owner of this palace in the 20th century, first half of 20th century. And she spied for the Brits during the Second World War, and at a certain point she returned to Hungary as a person who smuggled letters, secret letters, when the English Secret Service tried to make connections with the Hungarian opponents of Horthy and Nazi Germany. She was, of course, identified and imprisoned then. She faced the death penalty, but in the last minute, of course, she survived and she was exchanged for another spy who was a Hungarian. After the war, or at the very end of the war, she returned to Kőszeg, but then she was arrested by the Russians. So overall her life was not very lucky, but in the end she was able to return to London and live there a relatively peaceful life for the remaining years. This palace is very important for us, for people who live in Kőszeg and for also those who work in the institution, because this belonged to two families, the aristocratic Festetics family and the Csernál. Both families played key role in the history of Kőszeg. There's a funny picture here. It was taken from Vienna, most likely by a maid of the Czernál family, sometime during the 1870s or 80s. There is a little poem which in German, which explains the picture itself. This is a caricature. It's a fun, they are making fun of the Industrial Revolution through an age-old dream, how old women can be turned into young. This is a machine, old women are put into the machine and they come out as beautiful young ladies. It's an irony about the technical revolution. Kőszeg is well known for her wines, and this was especially true in the 18th century and before that. So when this palace was renovated in the 1770s, Kőszeg was in Kőszeg, vineyards were very famous, and the training of the wine was one of the most important activity of the city's inhabitants. This picture, this fresco on the ceiling, seen from the Old Testament. Moses sent his spies to Canaan, and they were ordered to detect actually the country or that territory. They came back, they returned with this huge grape, which of course the message is that Canaan was a very rich country. This is the most important room of the palace. All the walls were very richly decorated. Unfortunately, most of the paintings were repainted during the socialist time period, when the whole palace was cut into small pieces and people just used it differently from the original historical functions, of course. But in this room you can find a beautiful picture of a bird. This motif is pretty widespread in Kőszeg, so in different palaces in the downtown you can identify the same exact motif. The plague column was erected at the beginning of the 18th century. Actually, Kőszeg was not hit by the plague very badly, but still many people died. But compared to Western Europe, still the plague was not too bad in this region. After the end of this epidemic, the Catholics decided to erect a column to express that the victory, or as a symbol of the victory over the illness. This behind me is a wonderful building erected in the middle of the 19th century. This is a synagogue, the synagogue of Kőszeg, closely attached to the community, the Jewish community here in the city. Well, we could begin the story in the Middle Ages, but now I would rather just talk about the last 150 years, roughly. In 1798, a very important figure, representative of the Jewish community of the city, was born here in Kőszeg. His father moved from the neighboring Lakompak here. He wanted to make a bigger career as a Jewish merchant than it was possible in Lakompak. That's why he moved to Kőszeg. The Jewish community contributed to the civilization and economic development of the city to a great degree in the first half of the 19th century and also in the later period. Fülöp Sej was responsible for the synagogue. He was able to finance the construction of the building itself, and he also gave money for other purposes here in Kőszeg. So the Jewish community and the city in parallel was developing for decades. Without going into all the details, the tragic end of this coexistence of the Hungarians, the Germans, the Croats and the Jews here ended during the Second World War, especially after the German occupation of the country during the spring of 1944, when the Jews were deported and tragically they were moved to Auschwitz. The last rabbi of Kőszeg also died in Auschwitz, and we know about the details of his family life from his son, who came back to the city and visited his father's last home here, and the remainings of the Jews. This belongs to them. I mean, this wonderful building. Hopefully it will be reconstructed soon. Behind me you can see this beautiful church building erected in the very end of the 19th century in New Gothic style, which is a historical style all over the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. This is the symbol of Catholic life in Kőszeg, because for decades the local people collected money to be able to build this church. The community became relatively large, and those historical churches which are available in the downtown were not huge enough anymore for a larger community. So that's why they decided to invest money into the church, which later served as an important center for the Catholics in Kőszeg. An important priest in the church was László Székely, who started his service right before the Second World War in 1938. And he came into Kőszeg with big expectations. He expected a Catholic revival and worked on that very hard. But unfortunately, the war interrupted this procedure. He left behind a memoir, a combination of a diary and a memoir, from which we can reconstruct how he tried to serve and do his best as a priest for the Catholic people and also the others. After the war, he was still here in Kőszeg, and he had to witness how the communist system destroyed the religious community. Sándor Szemző built this house, and this is very unique for the downtown because this is the only Jugendstil house in Kőszeg, at least in this very small circle. Here behind me you can see his certificate as a young lawyer when he received the university from the King Franz Joseph. Sándor Szemző left the city for Szombathely, and then his daughter got married to Dénes Görög, who was a doctor, and he became an important figure at the hospital of Szombathely. And they raised Sándor, the survivor of the Holocaust, who survived the difficult months of 1944 here at Kőszeg, and he actually told his story in his memoirs.